In the dim light of a dusty attic in a quaint French town, perhaps outside Lyon, an extraordinary discovery lay hidden for over a century. Among yellowed manuscripts and personal documents carefully preserved by the Rivet family, a wax cylinder recording was found, dated March 1869, just a month before the passing of Hippolyte Léon Denisard Rivet, better known by the pseudonym Allan Kardec. The cylinder, miraculously intact, contained what appear to be the intimate final reflections of the codifier of Spiritism, words that were never meant to see the light of day, suppressed for decades by the religious and scientific authorities of the time. The recorded voice, though frail with age, still carried the characteristic depth of the man who revolutionized the Western understanding of the afterlife. Kardec spoke not as the meticulous pedagogue the world knew, but as a man who had contemplated the deepest abysses of the human soul, and returned with revelations that challenged all the moral and religious conventions of his era. His words, recorded in a moment of extreme vulnerability, when the proximity of death had dissolved all social masks, revealed truths about the fate of humanity's darkest souls, truths he considered too dangerous to share publicly. The tone of his voice conveyed a profound melancholy, mixed with an almost painful understanding of human nature. Kardec had dedicated the last years of his life not only to compiling the teachings of superior spirits, but also to investigating, through private mediumistic sessions, the fate of those who had committed the most heinous crimes against humanity. His research led him to spiritual territories that few mortals would dare explore, regions where divine justice manifested in ways that transcended any human concept of punishment or redemption. For years, Kardec had kept to himself disturbing communications received from spirits who identified themselves as having been, in past lives, tyrants, merciless conquerors, and architects of genocides. These entities, in states of indescribable suffering, had sought out the codifier, seeking understanding, revealing aspects of the afterlife that he considered too revolutionary for the humanity of his time. What disturbed him most was not only the nature of these sufferings, but the discovery that even the most corrupt souls carried within them a divine spark that could never be completely extinguished. The recording revealed that Kardec had established communication with an entity who identified itself as having been, in a previous incarnation, a Roman emperor known for his extreme cruelty. This spirit, through a trusted medium of Kardec's, had described its post-mortem journey in detail that caused the codifier to question everything he had understood about cosmic justice. The soul of this ancient tyrant had spent centuries in a state that transcended any human concept of hell, not as external punishment, but as a natural consequence of its own spiritual vibrations. What most impressed Kardec was the discovery that the suffering of these spirits was not imposed by external forces, but generated by the very expanded consciousness that death provided. Upon disembodiment, these souls found themselves confronted with every moment of pain they had caused, not as distant observers, but directly experiencing the suffering of each of their victims. It was as if, at the moment of death, the veil of individuality tore, revealing the fundamental interconnectedness of all consciousnesses. Through mediumistic communications that he kept in absolute secrecy, Kardec had discovered that there were regions of the spiritual world where souls like Hitler, Stalin, and other tyrants of history found themselves after death. These regions were not dungeons created by a vengeful god, but states of consciousness generated by the very spiritual nature of these entities. The vibratory density of their actions had created around them a kind of energetic prison where they continuously relived the consequences of their actions. The codifier had been deeply disturbed to discover that a spirit who identified itself as having been Nero had sought to establish communication through a medium in Paris. The entity described its post-mortem condition as a state of terrifying lucidity, where every flame it had ordered lit, every life it had taken, every moment of terror it had caused, returned to it multiplied by thousands. It was not an external punishment, but the law of cause and effect operating in its purest and most implacable form. Kardec observed through these communications that death did not magically transform the nature of these souls. They carried with them the same tendencies, the same vibratory patterns they had cultivated during their incarnations. The difference was that in the spiritual world, these tendencies manifested in an amplified way, creating psychic environments that corresponded exactly to the inner state of each consciousness. It was as if each soul created around itself a perfect reflection of its own inner nature. What intrigued the codifier most was the discovery that these souls were not abandoned by divine mercy. Through communications with superior spirits, he had learned that there were entities of light who dedicated themselves specifically to the work of rescuing these lost consciousnesses. These missionary spirits, often former disciples of Jesus or other great spiritual masters, descended into the densest regions of the spiritual world to offer opportunities for redemption to those who had completely turned away from the light. Kardec documented in his secret archives communications with spirits who identified themselves as having been victims of historical tyrants, and who, in the spiritual world, work to assist their own executioners in their journey of purification. This revelation had deeply shaken his understanding of forgiveness and cosmic justice. He discovered that divine love operated through mechanisms that completely transcended human logic, where victims and executioners eventually met in a process of mutual healing. During his investigations, Kardec received communications from spirits who claimed to have been in past lives Nazi soldiers, medieval inquisitors, and other perpetrators of historical atrocities. These entities described a gradual process of spiritual awakening that could take centuries, even millennia, to complete. The first stage was always the acknowledgement of the harm caused, followed by a period of suffering proportionate to the damage inflicted. Only after this phase of purification through pain could the soul begin its true journey of redemption. The codifier had discovered that some of these souls remained trapped in a kind of temporal loop, continuously reliving the darkest moments of their earthly lives. They couldn't advance in their spiritual evolution until they could truly confront the nature of their actions. It was as if they were trapped in an eternal nightmare, created by their own refusal to accept responsibility for their deeds. Through a particularly sensitive medium, Kardec had established contact with an entity who identified as having been one of the architects of the Holocaust. This spirit described its post-mortem condition as a state of fragmented consciousness, where different aspects of its personality remained trapped in different moments of its earthly life. The part of it that had ordered mass executions was eternally reliving the horror in the eyes of its victims, while the part that had once been an innocent child wept incessantly for the loss of its own humanity. What most disturbed Kardec was the discovery that these souls weren't monsters from birth, but had become what they were through gradual choices that led them further and further away from the divine light. He had learned that even Hitler had been, at some point in his existence, a soul with potential for good, but that the scars of previous incarnations and the obsessive influences of lower spirits had gradually corrupted his original nature. For those joining us on this journey of discovering spiritual mysteries, subscribe to our channel to continue receiving revelations like this, which unravel the deepest secrets of human existence and the afterlife. The communications Kardec had received revealed that the process of redemption for these souls followed universal patterns, although each case was unique in its complexity. First came the awakening to the true nature of their actions, a process often accompanied by intense suffering. Then there was a period of spiritual isolation, where the soul remained separated from other consciousnesses until it could begin to process its experiences. Gradually, missionary spirits approached, offering opportunities for service and reparation. The codifier had documented cases where souls who had been tyrants in past lives returned to Earth under extremely difficult circumstances, often as their own victims. He had received communications from spirits who claimed to have been, in one incarnation, perpetrators of genocide, and in a subsequent life, victims of similar persecution. This was how the law of cause and effect operated in its most refined manifestation, offering opportunities for understanding through direct experience. Kardec had discovered that even in the most extreme cases, where souls had become corrupted to the point of seeming irrevocably lost, there was always the possibility of redemption. He had received communications from spirits who claimed to have been in distant lives conquerors responsible for continental devastations, and who now work as spiritual guides, dedicating their existences to the protection and guidance of evolving souls. The process of transforming these shadowy consciousnesses followed a pattern Kardec had identified through decades of research. First, there was the period of denial, where the soul refused to accept responsibility for its actions. Then came the painful awakening, where the expanded consciousness of death forced the recognition of the truth. This was followed by a period of suffering proportionate to the evil caused, not as divine punishment, but as a natural consequence of the spiritual vibrations generated by the acts themselves. Kardec had learned that some of these souls developed a kind of spiritual resistance, creating psychic barriers that prevented them from receiving help. They became like spiritual black holes, absorbing negative energy and repelling any attempt at rescue. Centuries of patient work by missionary spirits were needed to penetrate these defenses and begin the healing process. The codifier had documented communications with spirits who identified as having been medieval inquisitors, cruel Roman emperors, and other historical figures known for their atrocities. All described similar experiences: an initial period of confusion after death, followed by a gradual awakening to the true nature of their acts, and finally a long and painful process of spiritual purification. Through these investigations, Kardec had arrived at a revolutionary understanding of the nature of divine justice. He had discovered that there was no external punishment in the traditional sense, but only the natural consequences of each soul's spiritual choices. Post-mortem suffering wasn't imposed by a vengeful God, but generated by the expanded consciousness that death provided. It was as if each soul became its own judge, jury, and executioner. What most impressed Kardec was the discovery that even in the most extreme cases, divine mercy operated in subtle and profound ways. He had received communications from spirits who claimed to have been responsible for genocides in past lives and who now work tirelessly to repair the harm caused. Some became protective spirits of children, others dedicated themselves to rescuing lost souls, and some returned to Earth on specific missions of service to humanity. Kardec had discovered that time in the spiritual world operated differently from earthly time. Souls who had caused suffering to millions could remain in states of purification for spiritual equivalents of earthly millennia. It wasn't an arbitrary punishment, but the natural time needed for consciousness to fully process the consequences of its acts and develop the spiritual qualities for redemption. The codifier had learned that some of these souls developed such a profound understanding of the suffering they had caused that they became specialized instruments of divine mercy. They were like spiritual surgeons who, having experienced the depths of human darkness, possessed unique knowledge of how to assist other souls in similar processes of purification. Through secret mediumistic communications, Kardec had discovered that specific regions of the spirit world were dedicated to the work of redeeming these lost souls. These regions were overseen by highly evolved spirits specializing in rescue work. They were like spiritual hospitals where souls deeply wounded by their own choices could receive treatment and guidance. The codifier had documented cases where souls who had been tyrants returned to Earth not as leaders, but as humble servants, dedicating their lives to alleviating human suffering. Some became doctors working with war victims, others dedicated themselves to caring for orphans and refugees, and some became human rights activists fighting against the same injustices they had perpetrated in past lives. Kardec had learned that the process of redemption was not only individual, but often involved a spiritual encounter between executioners and victims. He had received communications from spirits describing deeply emotional encounters in the spirit world, where former enemies embraced in mutual forgiveness, recognizing that they were all part of a great cosmic drama designed to promote the spiritual evolution of humanity. Kardec's deepest revelations came from communications with spirits who identified themselves as highly evolved spiritual guides, but who, in distant lives, had been responsible for unimaginable atrocities. These spirits described their journey of transformation as a process of spiritual death and rebirth, where everything they had been needed to be completely dissolved for a new consciousness to emerge. The codifier had discovered that the very nature of evil was an illusion created from separation from the divine source. Souls who committed atrocities were not intrinsically evil, but had become so completely lost in their egoic identifications that they had forgotten their true spiritual nature. The process of redemption was essentially a process of remembrance, where the soul gradually recalled its divine origin and cosmic purpose. Through these investigations, Kardec had arrived at an understanding he considered too dangerous to share publicly. He had discovered that some of the most evolved souls in the spirit world were those who had experienced the most extreme depths of spiritual degradation. It was as if the very process of falling and redemption was a specialized form of cosmic education, designed to create beings of extraordinary compassion and wisdom. The codifier had learned that even Hitler, Stalin, and other tyrants of history would eventually find their way back to the light. It wouldn't be a quick or easy process, but the very nature of divine creation ensured that no soul would be eternally lost. It was a truth that defied all conventional notions of justice, but revealed the infinite depth of cosmic mercy. In his final days, Kardec received a communication that deeply disturbed him. A spirit identifying as Jesus had transmitted a message through a trusted medium, revealing that he himself had worked directly with some of the darkest souls in human history. Christ explained that his love knew no bounds or exclusions, and that he had personally guided tyrants and genociders through their processes of redemption. The most impactful revelation came from Kardec's own personal experience. In the last months of his life, he had begun to receive direct visions without the need for intermediary mediums. In these visions, he had witnessed encounters between victims and executioners in the spirit world, where scenes of forgiveness and reconciliation unfolded with a beauty and depth that transcended any human description. Kardec understood that his own earthly mission was coming to an end, but that the work of revelation would continue through other instruments. He had left secret instructions for these communications to be kept until humanity was ready to receive them. He knew that the premature revelation of these truths could cause scandal and misunderstanding, but he trusted that the right time would come for them to be shared. In his last recorded words, Kardec reflected on the paradoxical nature of human existence. He had learned that the darkest and most luminous souls were, in essence, different facets of the same cosmic consciousness. Evil was not an independent force, but the temporary absence of the remembrance of divine unity. Good was not an individual achievement, but the natural expression of the soul when it remembered its true nature. The codifier understood that his own earthly journey had been a preparation for understanding these deeper truths. Every mediumistic communication, every spiritual revelation, every moment of doubt and questioning had been part of a larger process that had led him to this final understanding. That divine creation was a living organism where every soul, however lost it might seem, has an essential role to play in the great cosmic drama of universal evolution. At the end of the recording, Kardec's voice became almost a whisper, carrying a profound reverence for the magnitude of the truths he had discovered. He spoke of death not as an end, but as a graduation to a state of consciousness where these truths would become evident to him. He expressed his confidence that on the other side, he would continue his work of revelation, helping humanity gradually understand the true nature of spiritual existence. The final recorded phrase resonates as an eternal echo through time, that the human soul, at its deepest essence, is indestructible and eternally connected to the divine source. Even when seemingly lost in the deepest darkness of spiritual ignorance, it carries within itself the seed of redemption and the promise of eventual reunion with the light. The fate of tyrants and saints is ultimately the same, the conscious return to the divine unity from which they were never truly separated. The journey may be long and arduous, but the final destination is always light, always love, always the perfect understanding of the eternal truth that connects all consciousnesses in the grand tapestry of infinite creation.